Hey, good morning, everyone. It's now 10 o'clock Mountain Time, which is where I am, and noon Eastern. So we're going to get started now. Thank you all for joining us on this week's Inky 2020 Research Bite that we're holding instead of our annual conference because of COVID. So thank you all for being here. We really do appreciate the tremendous support that we have had with all of the webinars, and that has allowed us to have some great diversity and discussions just like we're going to have today. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. As usual, we ask that you put yourselves on mute on your own end. I will be muting all of you from my end, but just in case there are any weird glitches with technology, as we've seen has happened a few times, just that way we don't end up having any kind of weird sounds in the background. In addition, there will be time for a Q&A at the end, so if you want to send either Andrea or I your questions via the chat or just to everybody via the chat, that would be great. That way we only have to look in one spot to see if there are any questions. And we will end up as well sending any further questions that you might have, if you think of them after the fact, to Sarah to answer, and I will be sure and send those back on out to everybody. So Sarah today is going to be describing her research project for her PhD that's investigating rat-associated zoonoses in urban rats from Ontario. And she'll be discussing the use of rats that are sourced from pest control companies and findings of zoonotic pathogen testing to date, and then discussing some of the next steps to better understand urban zoonotic disease transmission from rats. There is a 2018 graduate from OVC. She graduated in 2018 and is working with the Department of Pathobiology at the University of Guelph. And she's incredibly passionate about One Health. We've had a couple of conversations now, and her research, including the rat-associated zoonoses, has piggybacked on some of the other research that has come out of both OVC and the WCVM. So I'm interested to see where we're going from here. Anybody who knows me at all knows coming from Alberta, I have a horror of rats. So I'm intrigued. It's over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Jasmine. And thank you to Jasmine and Andrea and other organizers and participants of this seminar series. I'm so grateful to have the chance to present my ongoing PhD research to all of you, whether you're at work, at a home office, or sitting at your kitchen counter like me. So thanks for tuning in today. To set the stage for discussing my research project at the University of Guelph, I will start with a background of Norway rats in the urban environment and rat-associated zoonoses. Then I'll dive into the rationale and objectives for this project and an overview of how we will achieve these. Then I'll present some of the preliminary results from rats we have received and processed to date, including their demographic characteristics, carcass quality assessment, and pathogen testing. And finally, I will conclude by addressing the limitations, significance, and the future steps of our work. Across the globe, urbanization is occurring at a rapid rate. At present, 55% of the world's human population is living in urban areas, with that proportion expected to reach 68% by 2050, according to the United Nations. North America is the most urbanized region in the world, with 82% of its population currently living in urban areas. Urbanization results in environmental modifications, including fragmented habitat, microclimate shifts, and increased density of roads and buildings. These environmental modifications disturb the habitat of native species and favor relatively few wildlife species that have adapted to urban environments, which can be classified as urban exploiters. Urban exploiter species are species that thrive in built environments near urban centers and subsist on food and habitat associated with human presence rather than naturally occurring resources. Rapid expansion of urban exploiter species like raccoons, pigeons, and the Norway rat can increase contact between previously disconnected animal and human populations, This may exacerbate the risk of zoonotic pathogen transmission. Norway rats, or brown rats, Rattus norvaicus, are among the most ubiquitous rodents in the world, and they are so adaptable that they infest virtually all cities across the globe. Genus Rattus arose approximately 3 million years ago and rapidly dispersed across the world, a range expansion made possible primarily through global maritime shipping. The distribution of Norway rats is now almost worldwide. They are found on every continent except Antarctica. The province of Alberta is an exception and shares Antarctica's rat-free status. So no worry, Jasmine, you're rat-free in Alberta. According to the government of Alberta, it remains free of rats through a vigorous extermination policy. Rats are exceptionally well suited to close cohabitation with humans. As anyone that has dealt with a rat infestation can attest, rats have a rapid growth rate and a tremendous reproductive capacity. For example, after reaching sexual maturity at just 3 months of age, and with a gestation period of only 3 weeks, a single female Norway rat can contribute up to 55 offspring per year to the population. Rats in urban environments grow and sexually mature more rapidly when compared to rural rats, and this is likely due to an abundance of resources in urban versus rural areas. In urban environments, there may be variation in growth and sexual maturation rates among cities and even within different cities or different areas of a city. Reproductive cycles are not constant, and rats may reproduce year-round in cities with favorable conditions. In temperate climates, variations in reproductive activity have been linked to seasons, with activity peaking in the spring and fall and declining in the winter. Now, rats may reproduce like crazy, but they have a short lifespan. The probability of dying is 90 to 95% per year, meaning most rats do not survive beyond 1 year of age. This does not appear to vary among geographic locations or habitats. However, males tend to die at a younger age than females. If the environment is stable, a rat population size will be stable. So natural phenomena or human activities, such as demolitions and construction, may disturb the environment and alter a population. Intensive trapping or baiting of rats may alter the size or social structure of a rat colony. However, once that intervention stops, the population will quickly rebound. Rats have a relatively small home range determined by many factors, including the availability of food, interspecific competition, presence of predators, and particularly barriers to rat movement. In the urban environment, streets are a significant barrier to rat movement and limit the home range to a single city block. Short distance dispersal of rats occurs in an urban area. However, dispersal over long distances is relatively uncommon. It may occur due to extreme environmental change or inadequate resource availability. And this can result in considerable variation in rat distribution, even over a very short geographic distance within a city. There are significant issues associated with rats in urban environments, including displacement and reduction of native species, damage to infrastructure, economic costs associated with spoiled food products and pest control efforts, and public health risks, including direct and indirect effects on mental health and rat-associated zoonoses. Rats can carry a diversity of viral, bacterial, and parasitic zoonotic pathogens that cause morbidity and mortality in humans all across the world. First example I'm sure we're all aware of would be Yersinia pestis, the causative agent of bubonic plague, which is transmitted through rat fleas and killed 40% of the European population in the 14th century. Some are pathogens for which rats are the natural host, such as Leptospira interrogans, the causative agent of leptospirosis, which is considered the most widespread zoonosis in the world. Streptobacillus monoileiformis, the causative agent of rat bite fever, and Solhantavirus, the causative agent of hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome. Rats can also be colonized with pathogens present in their environment and may be a potential source of these infections in humans. Clostridioides difficile could be an example, the main cause of infectious diarrhea that develops in human patients after hospitalization and antibiotic treatment, and methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, a leading cause of human bacterial infections ranging from minor skin infection to fatal pneumonia. Other pathogens are considered potentially zoonotic, such as hepatitis E virus, a cause of acute hepatitis in people. Now, pigs are thought to be the primary reservoir of HEV, but studies have shown that rats may also be carriers. Which brings me to our study. The prevalence of zoonotic pathogens in rat populations is highly variable among cities and even within cities on a very small geographic scale. This non-uniform distribution has significant implications for analysis and interpretation, and site-specific prevalence of zoonoses may be more relevant from a public health standpoint. Therefore, it's important that we investigate these pathogens in our own Ontario cities. The majority of studies investigating this issue utilize systematic trap removal methods, which are costly, time-consuming, labor-intensive, and often very challenging in an urban area. These are very important considerations when thinking about research and disease surveillance. Few studies have attempted to use alternative sources, such as rats collected by pest control professionals. Pest control source rats may represent a cost-effective method for surveillance of these pathogens. Which brings me to the first objective of this research project, to determine the utility of pest control source rats for zoonotic pathogen testing. And secondly, to determine if select rat-associated zoonotic pathogens were present in a sample of pest control sourced rats from a region of Southern Ontario. We are studying 3 cities across Southern Ontario: Windsor, Hamilton, and Toronto. And these were identified among the top 10 rattiest cities in Ontario by Orkin Canada in 2018. This project started in fall 2018 with the recruitment of pest control companies from Windsor, Hamilton, and Toronto. Carcass collection was initiated in winter 2018 and will continue through 2021. These rats are killed as part of pest control measures by private companies which service residential, commercial, and industrial locations. Carcasses are collected and frozen until they can be delivered to the University of Guelph for necropsy. Each carcass is submitted with the name of the company, the date and location of collection, and the cause of death if known, which is most commonly snap trap or rodenticide. All rats collected by pest control professionals undergo full necropsy. Each rat is assigned a unique ID number. Rats are photographed, weighed, and measured. And we record rat demographic characteristics like sex and sexual maturity based on testicle position in males and open or closed vaginal orifice in females. And we also record characteristics like body condition score and volume of internal fat. We assess carcass quality based on degree of decomposition, which is an important aspect of determining the utility of these rats. And we collect all kinds of tissue samples for pathogen testing. This is a summary of the zoonotic pathogens we are investigating, the tissue collected for testing, and the assay performed, which includes Leptospira species, Streptobacillus moniliformis, Rickettsia and Bartonella species, C. diff, MRSA, Sol hantavirus, and HEV. Testing is being conducted at the University of Guelph, at the Centre for Public Health and Zoonoses, and the National Microbiology Laboratory in Winnipeg. To date, 123 urban rats have been fully processed. This preliminary data from pest control submissions was very important to inform us of whether these rats were of adequate quality, or in other words, not too decomposed to be useful for the purpose of this research project. Warning of necropsy photos coming up in the next slide. Various methods of rat control are used by the pest control professionals, and these can affect carcass quality and our ability to sample for pathogen testing. Additionally, there can be advanced decomposition of carcasses due to delayed freezing in the field. So technicians are often working in the field all day, and it may be several hours before they have a chance to bring carcasses to where the freezer is stored. As well, this is beyond their normal call of duty. They wouldn't normally actually collect many carcasses, so they're actually going back to the sites where they've treated and collecting carcasses purely for the purpose of this project. On the left is a rat that is fairly fresh with only mild decomposition. The middle image shows a rat with moderate decomposition. You can see some organs are discolored, but they're still identifiable. And on the right would be advanced decomposition, where some internal organs are intact, but others are extremely friable or even liquefied. So in this rat, you can also see blue discoloration in the abdomen, and that's due to rodenticide, which can also affect our tissue quality. We found a statistically significant association between carcass quality and our ability to sample for pathogen testing, which indicated that we're less likely to obtain samples from rats with advanced decomposition. But fortunately, overall, over 90% of pest control company submissions had only mild or moderate decomposition and were of adequate quality to obtain the necessary samples for zoonotic pathogen testing. Of the 123 urban rats submitted from all 3 cities, there was a roughly 50-50 split of males to females, and there were more adults than juveniles. And these ratios are consistent with other studies that tend to trap more male, sexually mature rats. The mean length of submitted rats was about 19 centimeters, and the mean weight about 186 grams, with our largest rat weighing in at over half a kilogram or 1.2 pounds. Detected pathogens were found in all 3 cities, except MRSA, which was not detected in Windsor. The proportion of rats positive for these pathogens vary between cities. The range of percent positive rats for each pathogen is summarized here in the table. For example, the percent positive for Leptospira interrogans was 9.1% in Windsor, 11.1% in Hamilton, and 18.5% in Toronto. Hantavirus and Rickettsia were not detected in any rats tested, suggesting that these pathogens are not endemic in the study population. However, it's currently unclear if these pathogens are truly absent or a result of undersampling. Our preliminary results suggest that rat carcasses obtained from pest control professionals may be suitable for zoonotic pathogen testing, and urban rats in Ontario carry a diversity of zoonotic pathogens. Now, no research project would be complete without a thorough understanding of its limitations. Firstly, because we're collecting rats from pest control company efforts, there may be a selection bias at both the level of pest control intervention and trapping efforts. And as with many wildlife studies, there is concern over sample size. When working with pest control companies, it's critical we keep them engaged in sample submission, and this can be really challenging, especially over a long period of multiple years, since many technicians are going out of their way to help with this project. It's also important that we recognize and appreciate their expertise regarding rat trapping in an urban environment. Another limitation to consider when partnering with pest control professionals is the need for specific location data in order to conduct spatial analysis. In our preliminary sample, this was provided for about 80% of carcasses, which emphasizes the importance of communication between researchers and collaborating pest control professionals to ensure all required data are collected. And finally, there are specific constraints and challenges regarding the urban field, such as the complexity of the urban experimental unit and how rats are distributed heterogeneously within cities. These must all be considered when we plan further steps of this research and complete the project and think about the significance of its results. Given the unprecedented rate of urbanization, the importance of rat-associated zoonoses is expected to increase as more people come into contact with urban rats. The complex interactions of a number of factors require further consideration in order to have a comprehensive understanding of zoonotic pathogen carriage in Ontario rat populations. This will allow us to estimate the potential health risks posed to humans and develop informed and effective strategies to monitor and potentially mitigate those risks. And finally, identify a feasible and cost-effective source of samples for research and disease surveillance in the future. Our ongoing work includes continued collection of pest control source rats, as well as a planned systematic trap removal study in Hamilton, Ontario. Once data collection is complete, we will perform spatial analysis to map the distribution of zoonotic pathogens and identify spatial clusters of infection. Evaluating spatial distribution is especially important when pathogens are highly clustered, which is the case with rat-associated zoonotic pathogens in rat populations. Weather and environmental factors, which may affect pathogen prevalence and distribution through their effect on rat, vector, or pathogen ecology. Host factors can include things like sex, age, and body condition. For example, the probability that a rat will be infected with Leptospira increases with age and is positively associated with bite wounds, suggesting social structure and interactions among rats may influence pathogen transmissions. When considering weather, we can look at temperature, humidity, and precipitation. And for environmental factors, land use, building condition, and presence of garbage are of particular importance. Risk factor analysis will provide a more thorough understanding of the ecology of zoonotic pathogens in Ontario urban rats, because we need to mitigate these risks, but rather than viewing cities as simply belonging to humans and invaded by rats, we should recognize that rats are a part of this urban ecosystem, and hopefully we can shift our focus to managing the ecosystem, which involves understanding the environmental factors related to rats and rat-associated zoonoses. And I would just like to thank particularly my supervisor, Dr. Claire Jardine, as well as my whole advisory committee, Drs. David Pearl, Scott Weiss, and Chelsea Hemsworth, my fabulous summer students, Rachel Feiner and Simon Jeeves, for all of their work in the necropsy room, pest control company collaborators for making all of this possible, the CDHC, CFAS, particularly Joyce, the National Microbiology Laboratory, Dr. Robin Lindsay and Antonio Di Bernardo, Arctic Systems, the whole wildlife lab, the postmortem room staff, as well as NSERC and OVC for providing my funding. And with that, I will pass it back to Jasmine for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. So I'm sure you're aware my skin was crawling the entire time. And I just wonder, so having spent a significant part of last summer electrocuting a whole lot of rats that ended up turning up in my backyard in Ottawa, have you actually thought at all about extending your collection out to members of the public who might be in the same sort of situation where they're doing some eliminating on their own?
Yes, it's actually an excellent consideration, and it addresses one of my concerns about using pest controls as a source, because we're selecting a part of the population that has motivation or can afford to hire a pest control professional, whereas many people would go to a hardware store and get traps themselves, or perhaps contact the city in hopes of having the issue addressed. So I think that's actually an excellent consideration. And when we conduct our trap removal study in Hamilton, I would like to contemporaneously have pest control company rats as well as citizen collected rats to have a comparison for the two different methods of collection. The concern there I would have is obviously expressing the necessary caution for people collecting rat carcasses, as well as having an easy place for them to store them. I wouldn't want people putting rat carcasses in their own freezer, in their own personal freezer. So it would be having sort of a depot where they could come and drop off sources, or perhaps calling me even if they were within a vicinity that I could come to. I could even just come and collect and they would have no reason to store. So just certain logistical things that I would have to address, but I think it would be a great addition to the project.
Right, exactly. And then have you found that similarly to some of the other urban environments where there have been pathogen studies done, that there are differences in the pathogens found in different regions of the city? And I guess part of that is socioeconomic breakdown, right?
Absolutely. So in different cities that have actually looked at risk factors associated with pathogen carriage, there is variation obviously among cities, but even within cities, pretty much down to the city block scale, there is significant differences. So in Vancouver, the Vancouver Rat Project, they found differences between adjacent blocks. So one block would have zero prevalence of a pathogen, and then the block directly adjacent could have high prevalence of a pathogen. And it just shows how isolated these colonies can be and the importance of studying at a very small scale when it comes to spatial analysis. So not necessarily looking at a city aggregate of what the prevalence is, but actually more detailed, which would allow us to address certain factors like socioeconomic status or the condition of housing and buildings in the area, or the presence of refuse in alleyways. And those things are actual habitat modifications we could make to control this.
Okay, exactly. And then have there been the opportunities yet to take a look at the reflected prevalence of those zoonotic diseases in humans?
So not in my project, not in the scope of my project, which would be incredible, but in general, transmission as humans is thought to be rare, but it's difficult to estimate since rat-associated zoonoses in humans is likely underreported, whether it's because clinically they are nonspecific often, like a general febrile illness, or because patients are not even aware of rat exposure. But there have been studies that look at these infections in urban homeless and marginalized individuals. And they have found exposure to certain zoonoses in these communities. I believe particularly in Vancouver, they found exposure to Bartonella tribicorum, but did not find Leptospira interrogans in the people studied. Yeah.
Right, okay. And then given everybody is talking about COVID right now, is that on the list of diseases that are being looked for?
So, based on susceptibility from other coronaviruses, I believe it's unlikely that rats are involved in transmission. As with SARS, rats are likely relatively resistant to infection, so unlikely that they would be wild reservoirs for SARS-CoV-2. But that's really all I can say right now. I'm sure there will be lots of research to come out about the virus and the possible role of wildlife. And even if we suspect that they're not involved in the transmission, it would be interesting to study because you never know. So it would be good to use our population of rats that we're collecting already and just grab one more tissue sample to submit for testing. But it's also interesting with COVID that it can have other effects on rat populations, whether they can transmit that pathogen or not. So there have been quite a few news and public health reports you have probably seen of increased rat sightings during the pandemic. And changes to rat populations could actually affect other pathogens. So, for example, changes in food availability can influence rat density, and aggressive interactions among rats that don't have access to abundant food could actually alter pathogen spread in different ways.
Well, and exactly. I think some of the biggest stories in April and May from Ottawa and Toronto had to do with the fact that the rats were basically on the move because there was no longer any garbage, right? And
absolutely.
And there have been stories about how many of the rat populations appear to be becoming cannibalistic. So
exactly. Which, if you think about transmission of other pathogens aside from SARS-CoV-2, there's serious implications there.
Exactly. Yeah. And so then there's the question, which I'm not necessarily certain that would necessarily be most applicable for you, but do you have suggestions on controlling rats in some of these cities?
I think I have a few. So I think it's obviously important that we try to mitigate the potential risks of rats, but often it's not feasible to eliminate them. I think successful rat management will require an ecosystem approach. Maybe that's because I'm biased towards One Health, but a One Health approach would allow us to adopt certain strategies that would be effective as opposed to simply trying to eliminate the rats themselves, which just is often not practical. For example, some cities are adopting integrated pest management, and that's an ecosystem-based strategy. And so for construction and demolition projects, they require supervisors to actually submit an integrated pest management plan prior to doing their project. Because if we address things like the quality of housing in cities, that had come up with certain areas of lower SES status, we could tackle rats without focusing on simply lethal rat control. And that's especially important because some studies have suggested that lethal rodent control programs can actually increase the prevalence of zoonotic pathogens in urban rat populations. So that's an important consideration as well when we look at lethal control. I think it's also really important when we look at controlling rats in cities that we recognize that these issues disproportionately affect impoverished areas. So I think control should really be targeted to those communities at higher risk.
Okay, then. And then based on that, there is a request if you can go through results just a bit, again, with respect to comparing the different cities that are involved in your study.
Yes, absolutely.
And while you find that slide, I don't know if you can multitask, but there is also the question, when rats are carrying multiple pathogens, have you noticed any kind of trend with respect to the multiple ones are found in the same rat?
So we have done some preliminary analysis at looking at co-infection, but when we do our further risk factor analysis and we do modeling, that's going to definitely be a key component. So I can't speak to the result of co-infection and relationships right now, but that is something that we are doing because obviously it's important to know if a rat is likely, if it carries one, is it actually likely to be carrying 2, 3, 4 or more? Right. So that is on our radar, but results of that. For sure. And then sorry, I had distracted you. You were that's okay. Yes.
You were going to do the comparison between communities.
Yes. So it does vary quite a bit if you look at certain pathogens. So if we look at the range for, I think, streptobacillus is quite a broad range. If we look at that, in Windsor, we had 27% or so. Hamilton, we had 44, and Toronto, we had 14. Now, a part of this problem is that right now these numbers are based on only 123 rats. So the 95% confidence intervals for each of these results are quite wide. So before I would do any sort of major comparing of city to city, I would want a larger sample size so that I could really be sure of what those numbers were. I'm not sure if this is also an issue of city aggregate data. So because I have the numbers here for Windsor as a whole and Hamilton as a whole and Toronto as a whole, if it's skewing results when really we need to look at it at a lower spatial scale, like something like a city block. And that way we would actually get a better idea of the percent positive at a smaller scale.
Okay, great. And so it is 10:30, so I know that there will be some people who need to leave. Sarah, are you available to, there's still a whole schwack of questions. Apparently I'm not the only one with that horror.
That's all right, I am available, yes.
Okay, so we'll continue answering questions until either we end up running out of time or there are no longer any questions. If people are needing to leave, I will compile some of these answers and send them out because I'm aware that not everybody can stay for those things. So next question, what seems to be the most difficult part then of working with the pest control companies and the rat sourced from them?
I think the hard part comes from them having to go really above and beyond to participate in the project. So if it was simply a matter of when they go out for pest control and they collect the rats and they bring them back, and that was already part of their regular job, but because they actually have to return to a place where they set traps or poisoning, collect the carcasses, and then also return them to either an office or a warehouse for their company to store the rats in a freezer, it's a lot of extra steps that they're wonderful for doing, but it does present a barrier for compliance. And another big issue we found was in the summer, if these technicians were out for an entire day in their van and they went out in the morning and collected rat carcasses and then had them in the back of their van for the day, I mean, they smell, they start to decompose. And by the time they get to them in the freezer, I mean, they may not want to go through that effort in the hot summer days when they have a car that's sitting somewhere. And as well, it will make the decomposition harder for our pathogen testing. So those are some serious barriers. And I think really to get over that, we need to really explain the goals of the project and the importance of their role in its success. But also we need to maintain involvement through ongoing communication. So actually getting feedback from the technicians about ways we can improve and simplify the process for them. Another option would be, and it's not really a consideration for this project given funding, but would be incentives. So in the future, something could be done like what's been done for hunters to encourage submission of samples for wildlife disease surveillance.
Okay, and so then would you be mapping the pathogens specifically within each city to decipher specific problem areas so that you can, I guess, create specific mitigation measures?
Yes, that's exactly the plan. So if we do spatial analysis and we can identify clusters of infection, we can look at those areas and evaluate things like land use or the quality of buildings, social economic status, and try to look for targets of potential control and mitigation. So that is the plan, yes.
Okay, then. And so there's a bit of surprise that there's been no sole virus found, especially since there have been outbreaks of the pathogen in feeder rodents in Ontario. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, sole hantavirus is an interesting one because it's believed to be ubiquitous and pretty much distributed worldwide. So we would expect it to be present in the rats. And really, my take home for that is that right now it could be an issue of undersampling. We only have 123 rats, and some of them didn't have tissue suitable for sole hantavirus testing. So 100 rats for 3 cities really isn't an adequate sample to determine whether it's truly absent. I would suspect that we have it, we just haven't found it. But all we can say right now is that it's absent in this subset of samples that we have.
Right. So another situation where it's having a negative doesn't really mean it's negative. It just means you haven't found it yet.
Exactly.
Okay. And so then there's a question on what is your motivation for doing a trapping study in addition to the pest control study?
A good question. So this part of the project, I'm hoping will give us a more complete understanding of these pathogens in rat populations. Essentially, we'll be looking at a smaller geographic scale. So we'll be using city block as our study unit, which is consistent with the rat colony's home range, as I mentioned. Also, by doing a trapping study, we can further evaluate the utility of pest control source rats by comparing the results of each sampling methodology with the results that they find. So this is standard for the type of research, trap removal. So if we use that as our standard and compare results from trap removal with our pest control, we can get an idea of whether they are, in fact, a good source for this testing.
Okay, excellent. And then do any of the pathogens that you're currently finding have particular significance for other wildlife?
Oh, another good question. So not actually wildlife. I'm going to deviate from the question for a second, but a big one that comes up when you say that for me is Leptospira interrogans for domestic animals, but as well as for wildlife. So canine Leptospira has been increasing, and so that's a concern, is transmission from not only wildlife to humans from sort of an increased contact because of urbanization, but as well from wildlife to domestic animals. But as well, I think it's hepatitis E virus is an interesting one because it's sort of up for debate and classified as potentially zoonotic because we're just not sure. And quite a number of wildlife, including rats, have been identified as potential sources for that virus.
Right. Well, and especially if you've got domestic animals as sort of like the middle ground, right? So it goes from wildlife, or I guess urban pests, to domestic animals, and if they're zoonotic, then there's that increased possibility to be transmitted to their human owners. So,
yeah, absolutely. That interconnection at so many levels.
Exponentially.
Yeah.
And then when you're working with multiple pest agencies, how have you helped ensure both that there's consistency with what happens with each of the different agencies, but also bridging collaboration and the compliance?
So one big thing is we do have a protocol sort of form. We have an info sheet, basically, that was presented to each pest control company. As well, we have a protocol for the submission of each sample. And we send with each, to each pest control company is a package, and it's bags for collection as well as already pre-labeled tags so that we get the same information with every single rat. And that actually came out of discussions and feedback from the pest control technicians that they wanted it to just be as simple as possible. And so we created pre-made packages for them. They can grab a bunch, keep them in the van, and when they come across rats, they can collect them. But a big change we've noticed is dealing with either a larger business like Able, or Orkin, that has locations all around Canada, or individual private companies like Windsor Pest Control is a single individually owned private company in Windsor. And that can be quite different because it means you're either working directly with the person that's collecting for you, or you might be working with a manager that then disseminates your information to the technicians. So that can alter how we approach that collaboration.
Okay. And last question, I think, at the moment, you mentioned selection bias as a possible limitation. Can you expand a little bit more on that and what you're doing to try and mitigate that in your analysis?
Yes, so one level of selection bias, which I briefly alluded to earlier, was that not every person that has a rat problem is going to contact a pest control company for help. So it, for a multitude of reasons, but it could be that they don't have the resources to hire a pest control company. It could be that they'd rather deal with the issue on their own. In that case, we wouldn't get those samples. Or it could be that they are calling the city to come in and trap and bait, and we also wouldn't be getting those samples. So we are getting a bias towards rat populations that are affecting people that will call pest control companies. And I think that a big way of addressing that is by doing our trap removal study in Hamilton while we also collect from pest control companies and doing modeling to compare the results.
Okay, great. So, Sarah, you gave an extra 10 minutes for questions. I will send those off to you so that you can write up a bit of a response so that I can send some of them back out to people. If that's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for all of your work and for being so flexible with everything that's happened. We do appreciate it, and we appreciate your time. And just as a note to everyone, we're wondering if you found the Inky sessions worthwhile, And with the ongoing COVID situation, if you'd like to see more in the fall, or if you know of anyone who would like to present, or if you yourself would like to present on some of your research or some of the work that you're doing, we're going to be making decisions on the value of continued research bites in the next few weeks, given the fact that COVID doesn't look like it's going to slow down anytime soon. And so please let us know if you think that this was of value so that we can factor that in. Next week, speaking of COVID, actually the next 2 weeks are going to be related to some of that. And so Dr. Robert Adamski is going to be talking next week about COVID and wildlife and the possible unforeseen effects that have occurred and what that actually means for wildlife rehabilitation. And then the following week, the first week of August, Dr. Lena Moses and one of her grad students are going to be talking about contact tracing for COVID-19 and how you can actually leverage the One Health workforce for a pandemic response. And Lena's actually with Gorn and the WHO, as well as being a professor down at Tulane. So both of those should be very interesting conversations. Please make sure that you stay safe this week, and don't forget to wash your hands. Have a great week, everybody. Okay, Sarah, that was great.
Thank you. It was fun.
Really, really well.
Thank you.
Really well.
I was very nervous for that question period. There were some hard ones, but it felt good. I felt good.
No. You had absolutely no reason to be at all concerned. That was
The conference has ended. You will now be disconnected.